this computer. So this is the training for the new PI indicator for sub-abuse. It's going to be replacing the old indicators 2 and 3. They're both being merged into one indicator, indicator 2B. This training is for access and ROSC access, both. When I talk about access through this training, I'm almost always referring to both of you. If I'm just referring specifically to ROSC providers or just specifically CMH, I will say so. And that'll happen near the end, down here. I'm going to talk about first the highlights from the state's codebook. If you want to see the full state's codebook that was sent out, it's attached to this calendar appointment. You can get all the good details there, but just going to go over the highlights first. Can everybody mute their lines, please? Unless you have a question. So first going to talk about the highlights from the state's codebook, so the rules that we are given. Then I'm going to talk about the enhancements to Cricket so that we can follow those rules. And then just to make sure everybody gets what's going on, there's going to be a quiz at the end. And I'll give you guys time to do it, and then we'll go over the answers together. So with that, let us begin. If you want to follow along on paper, make sure you are looking at the document that says it's dated 3/11. There were some last minute changes this morning. So first of all, highlights from the state's codebook. We're still talking about the time since request. So the request date, as always, is still the date that CMH or ROSC Access receives a telephone or walk-in request for a non-urgent service by the individual, parent of a minor, legal guardian, or from a referral. Can everybody please mute their lines if they're not asking a question? Thanks. So there are a couple details that the state was kind enough to iron out. They left it pretty loose before in the old incarnation, but we asked a ton of questions and they answered them. So this is the new stuff. First of all, something that probably hasn't been done before is how to handle missed calls. In the case of a missed call, the request is the date that the person first provides their name and contact information. For example, suppose a person calls on January 1st, they leave their name and their callback information requesting services. For whatever reason, they're not able to get a hold of Access. So they leave a message. Access calls them back, but is unable to reach them. Then the consumer calls back, let's say 2 weeks later on the 15th, and now they're able to contact Access and schedule their first face-to-face assessment. Even though Access didn't speak to them until the 15th, the request date is still the 1st. From the consumer's perspective, that's when they first called and left their contact information. Another thing that the state got more specific about is referrals. So a referral is when the request is being made by some outside organization, some third party, on behalf of the consumer. The request date for a referral is the date that they first make that call. Note, the consumer needs to be aware of the fact that the referral is taking place, and they need to consent to that referral in order for it to count. So let me give an example. Suppose the outside organization, the third party, calls on 1/1. They call CMH or ROSC Access on behalf of the consumer. At this point, CMH or ROSC Access has to ensure that the consumer is aware of this referral and that they agree to have their information taken. I literally do not know how this will go. I would say check your local procedure on what it takes to check this box. Then CMH or ROSC Access gathers enough information to be able to look up this date later if the consumer calls again. Then let's say the consumer calls 2 weeks later on the 15th. They call CMH or ROSC Access to schedule their intake. CMH and ROSC Access they're able to look through documentation and find the date that they were first called by provider A, let's say. So the request date is 1/1. On the other side of the equation, if there was no consent or if the consumer was not aware, this rule doesn't apply. So here's an example of what that would look like. Suppose provider A calls CMH or ROSC Access on behalf of the consumer on the 1st. They're requesting SUD services, but the consumer is not aware of this referral. Then the consumer calls 2 weeks later requesting services. The request date is 1/15. It's only 1/1 if the consent was given and they're aware and you have all that information gathered. There's only one special case for referrals, and that is if they are being referred from a residential facility. So normally it's the date that the call came in from the third party. If they're coming from a residential facility though, it is the discharge date. The idea being they can't get started on services until they're let out. One last thing that's kind of new here is the idea of new requests versus and expired requests. So if a person doesn't receive any subsequent services following their request and they call again, it's only considered new if it's been more than 60 days since that first call. So let's look at this example. Suppose somebody calls on January 1st, they schedule their first service on the 3rd, it's canceled. They call back on February 1st and they're like, nope, just kidding, I really do want to get into services. This is not a new request because it has not yet been 60 days since the initial call. It's considered a continuation of the call on 1/1. So let's say on February 1st, they scheduled their first service. On the 3rd of February, again, they no-show. And let's say they call again, this time on March 5th. This third call is a new request because it's more than 60 days from the initial call. So in this picture here, there are 2 reportable requests, not 3. The first request was on 1/1 and the second request was on 3/5. Again, the one on 2/1 is not a reportable request because it's a continuation of the one on January 1st. Are there any questions at this point? Nope. Thank you. Is that Wendy? Nope. Never mind. Okay. Another big change for this new indicator, whereas before we were only including cases that had an intake, in this new incarnation, we are including all approved requests, whether there's a first service or not. We'll talk later about what it means to be, quote, approved. Just suffice it to say, all of them got to be in. If that approved service goes on to receive, approved request goes on to receive services, great, we get the time to treatment. If it's not, it goes to the state as, quote, expired. So in that above example, we have one request on January 1st that's going to go to the state as expired because there was no first service. And then we'll have a second request that's not expired because they're in the drawing. There is a first service. Another big difference, there are no exclusions or exceptions this year. So before, the state would give us all sorts of opportunities to give legitimate reasons why there was no first service or the first service was delayed or what have you. That's not going to happen anymore. We still have to keep all the cancellation and rescheduling information, but not for the purposes of excluding or accepting cases. This will be used for PI purposes and also for the auditors. They're going to want to see that information. It's a requirement in the code book. The good news, though, is that there's no benchmark this first year. They just want to gather all the information and see where we are, and then look at everything they have, and then probably come up with some different PI indicators or benchmarks. The last big highlight I'd like to talk about from the state's code book is what it is we're measuring for this indicator. So the idea is they want to measure the time between the request and whenever the first service happens. Well, you know, there's this field in BH-TEDS called time to treatment that measures exactly that. So the state took the leap and they said, how about we just skip the middleman and we'll just be getting this indicators data straight out of BH-TEDS. So that's what it is we're going to be measuring. It's going to be taken straight out of BH-TEDS, time to treatment. Any questions at this point before I go over how our system, how Cricket was enhanced? Questions about the state's codebook? Nope. Okay. So we have the rules from the state. Now we have to make it fit with our system. The first thing we did to make it fit was get rid of all the stuff in the wrappers that really we don't need anymore. We simplified it down. Here's what is still going to be included. We're still going to have the assessed by. I'm sorry, we're still going to have the affiliate. I mean, we're still going to have the assessed by, which is a required field. The little red star says that. You can't get through a wrapper without putting that in. We're still going to have the SUD treatment agency. Usually these will be the same, but if we're talking about ROSC providers, they can be different. Although the SUD treatment agency is not a required field, in other words, you can get through this form and it won't force you to fill it in. It would really be in your best interest to fill it in just as soon as you know it. We'll talk later about how this could get in your own way if it's not filled in. For now, suffice it to say, fill it in when you know it. You'll be glad you did yourself that favor. And then the last thing that's staying here is the request date. And this is that deal that I've just been talking a lot about on the last few pages. What is the request date? And that's here. The other thing we had to concentrate on in the enhancements to the system is just to make sure we have a correct and complete data set. So you know the data is going to be coming from BH-TED, so our first focus was to make sure that the BH-TED time to treatment is correct. Time to treatment is composed of two things, really. One, the request date. Two, the date of the first service. And then three, time to treatment is the time first service minus the request date. So that's what we are honing in on. First step, make sure the request date is right. We have, after having spent some time with these wrappers and stuff, we have noticed, and probably we should have noticed before, that actually it's only Access or ROSC providers who could even really know what the request dates are. They are the ones who have the bird's eye view. They're the ones who know when the consumer truly first called and maybe left a message or whatever. So we are locking down the system. The system will no longer allow non-ROSC providers to enter their own wrappers and hence put in their own request date. The only exception to this is going to be if you're transferring a consumer within your same provider. This is not going to happen a lot, but let's say you're discharging from Hegira Detox and going to Hegira Residential. This is the only time you'd be allowed to make your own wrapper. After the discharge from Detox, you'll see this transfer consumer link in the wrapper. If you click that, a new wrapper will be created. The request date will be hard-coded in there as the discharge date from the previous one. Other than that, there is no way to create your own wrapper. This has to be done by whoever it is that takes the calls for you, either ROSC Access or CMH Access. So the second thing in the equation, admission date, that has to be correct. Until now, we've been saying that the SUD admission date is the intake date. Technically speaking, though, this was not right. This was just the definition that made the most sense given the structure of the old PI indicators and how everything was set up. But because of the new indicator design, we actually have to go with the federal definition of what this field should be. This is it. The SUD admission date that you enter on your SUD admissions and referral forms, it has to be the date of the first face-to-face service, any CPT code except H0002. This may be intake, but it doesn't have to be. If there's another face-to-face billable service before that, it would be that one. Now, ideally, we would know this information before you fill out the referral form or the SUD admission, but we can't. We have to wait for the claims and data sheets to come in. So this is the kind of thing we're going to have to just look at after the fact. We're going to be, after the admissions and referral forms and claims and data sheets are pulled in, checking that the date entered on the admissions and referral forms match the date of the first billable service. And then number 3, once we have the admission date correct and the request date, time to treatment should be a slam dunk. Since it's a very simple equation, we figured there's no sense in introducing human error into this thing. It'll be auto-calculated from now on. So as long as the admission date and the request date are filled in, time to treatment will be auto-calculated for you. Just a little note, if you happen to find out that there was an error in your data after the fact, like, oh shoot, I fat fingered it, turns out the request date was a little bit after that, or the admission date was a little bit before. Well, this time to treatment was actually entered as a BH TUDS record. So in order to fix it, the BH TUDS will need to be unlocked, and then the recalculation will happen, and then you'll resubmit it. Best if it's not, if you don't have to do that, obviously. Are there any questions at this point? Don't be
Looks
shy.
like there's a question in the chat.
The chat, okay, I don't have the chat open. Whoever put the question in the chat, can you just, please feel free to just ask it out loud.
It was from Melissa Vargas. So I'm assuming she's talking about the first service. She says, so this could include peer services?
I believe so.
As long as it's accountable.
As long as it's billable, face-to-face. Yeah. If I hear any differently, I'll tell you, but I mean, Joe, you were at the training there. I think Phil said if it's part of what they're asking for, part of their treatment,
Yeah.
then yes.
Yeah, peer service, engagement groups, anything that's face-to-face that you can enter a CPT code for, yes.
But not Hutu.
Yeah.
Everything but Hutu.
But not, nobody uses Hutu though in SUD, so
Oh, got it. All right. Just kidding. Thank you. Any other questions? That was a good one. Okay, moving right along. So that was about making sure our data is correct. The next step is we needed to make sure it was complete. So all approved requests need to be entered in a wrapper. And let me be more specific about what that means. For CMH access, this is just standard operating procedure, what you've been doing all along. You know, a request is approved if you authorize the consumer for a SUD provider. So whenever you know it's approved, that's when you enter the wrapper, that's when you put in the request date. For ROSC access though, since you're always authorized, you're pre-authorized for everything, it's a little different. At ROSC access, you know it's approved if the consumer is expected somewhere for their first service. Since ROSC providers will only enter a wrapper once the first service has been scheduled, they need to keep very careful track of the request date on their end in case there's any delay. Let me give an example. Suppose the consumer calls on 1-1, but for some reason no assessment is scheduled. Maybe they're put on a wait list or some other reason. Then they call back on 1-5. Again, no assessment scheduled for whatever reason. Could very well be a wait list situation or something else. Then they call back on 1-15, and this time an assessment is scheduled. So then that ROSC access provider would enter the wrapper. They would do it on the 15th, but in the wrapper, the request date is still 1-1. It's the day that the person first called. I said this before, but it bears repeating. They may not end up getting that first service, but it still has to be documented in a wrapper. Another thing that's really important here, because we don't share a calendar with ROSC providers, we have no way to verify the request date other than through audits. So audits will be performed on ROSC Access to ensure the request date matches the actual date that the person first called. So in these audits, we're going to randomly select consumers, ask to see all the wait lists, calendar appointments, clinical documents, call logs, what have you, and make sure that the request date is entered correctly. Are there any questions about this? Okay, so that's completeness. And then the last thing that we had to enhance for is making sure that 60-day expiration thing is enforced.
This is Angie from Livingston.
Hi.
Hi, I'm sorry. I had to figure out how to get you unmuted so I could ask a question.
Yeah.
When we're looking at these first request dates, we might get a request from someone from Macomb County who's looking to move here at some point. Are we supposed to be counting that as a first request?
Only if you've
Even if they
authorized.
aren't-
Ooh, we've got some
Okay, go
trippy
ahead.
feedback on that end, but only if you have authorized them for a SUD provider. If you just bounce them out, then no, it's not approved.
Okay, just double checking. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Any others? Okay. Angie, I'm going to mute your line.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. This is Bobby from Lenawee. I've been trying to unmute you too. I don't know what's going on with this, but I have a question in regards to somebody that is incarcerated.
Okay.
So we deal with individuals that are moving from incarceration to like a residential request.
Okay.
And so the date of service, we have to wait on the probation department to link and coordinate their care with whatever residential facility they seem fit to go to. So when would, I guess the request for service would be day one for when the person calls, but when we enter the SUD wrapper, that's going to be after they come in. Is that, I guess, how does that work, or how does that look?
So there's 2 days sort of floating around. One, the day that you know that they are expected somewhere for their service. And 2, that's when you enter the wrapper. And 2, the request date you stick in the wrapper.
Okay.
Coming out of jail, I am almost certain this is an example of coming out of a residential facility. I know residential has a very clinical meaning. Yeah, but this is, the idea is they cannot get started until they're let out. And so you would put, when you enter the wrapper as the request date, you would put the day that they were released from jail.
Okay. So just to clarify, if somebody called me today on 3/11, but we were able to get them placed, so basically what usually happens is they get discharged from jail and they're transported directly to that residential facility. So on 3/11, they make the request. However, they're not released from jail, let's say, till 3/15. So the request date would be 3/15?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Good question. Anything else? And Bobby, I don't think it would be a bad thing to enter that in the notes section of the wrapper. There's a little place here, notes, where you can type in whatever you think is pertinent information. It could look confusing if you can, it looks like you forward dated something. If it were me, I would just pop a note in there.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Jess, there's another one in the chat.
Can you read it, Jojo?
Yeah. In the past, case management was only available to clients if they were participating in a service. Does this still apply, or can case managers be a first face-to-face service?
I don't understand the question.
If you're encountering it, that is, what's that?
Did you understand the question? Do you want to take it?
Yeah, does case management count as a first service? And the answer is, if you're encountering it, then yes.
Any others? Okay, these are all great questions. Okay, so then I'm going to move on. We already talked about how to make sure the data are correct. The time to treatment is correct in BH-TUDS. We talked about how to make sure that it is complete. And the way we're doing this is with, really it's on you guys, but we're going to audit to make sure it's right. And then the last thing is we need to talk about how to make sure that 60-day expiration rule is enforced. We don't want too many wrappers and we don't want too few. So first we're going to talk about the situation, making sure we don't have too few. After 60 days have passed from the request date, wrappers expire. The request expires. At this point, you will not be allowed to add a SUD admission or a referral form to that wrapper. Any attempt to do so will result in this cryptic error message. So if you get this error and you're like, why are you telling me when the admission should be? What do you know? That's what it is. Most of the time, I think this should be pretty straightforward. If you try to enter a wrapper, you try to enter an admission and it doesn't let you, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it, it's expired. I think this is gonna be straightforward. I do need to talk though about a couple edge cases that might happen, because when they do, you're gonna wanna know what's up. So how about that example we already talked about where they call, they no-show, they call again, they no-show, 60 days passes, and then they call again. What are you supposed to do? This wrapper has expired. So in this case, if the person keeps calling and calling, and then that wrapper expires, if they call again, ROSC Access or CMH Access has got to direct, I'm sorry, whoever it is they're calling has got to direct them, the consumer, to call Access back and get screened and get a new wrapper put in. Is this, I want to make sure this is totally clear because I think there was some confusion about it. So the consumer needs to call Access again if they go past that 60-day mark. Questions? Okay. And here's the edgiest of edge cases. This is probably going to be super rare.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. This is Tiffany from Livingston County Access. I just want to confirm that when the original wrapper expires, we can add a new one beyond 60 days?
Yes.
Okay, won't be. All right. Just want to make sure.
That's a great question. I'm going to talk about it in just a second. How to enter another wrapper. Any other questions?
I have a question about the jail stuff.
Yes.
So was it correct that, so Dawn Farm has an in-jail program, so if our in-jail coordinator assesses a person on, March 11th and adds them, to the SPARA wait list to come here for short term, and then they get here at SPARA for short term on March 20th, is it correct that the request date would be the day they got to SPARA, not the day that they were assessed in the jail?
It's the day they were discharged from the jail.
Okay, so it would be ideally that day that they got to SPARA, that 3/20, so it wouldn't be the day that they were screened by the in-jail staff.
Yeah, if I'm understanding you right, they were screened by the in-jail staff before they were discharged, then yes, it's not that day. It's the day they actually left. And if they are transferred directly, then yeah, it would end up being the same as the admission date to SPARA.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. So we left off here. If they keep calling and no-showing, if they call again after the 60 days, they're going to have to be directed back to Access, that's you guys, and get a new wrapper put in and be rescreened. So this is going to be very rare, this next thing I'm talking about. I hope it's rare. Just want to talk about how to handle it, though, if it does happen. Let's say they're calling and no-showing and calling and no-showing, and their last call actually comes in before the 60-day mark. So there's no second call after 60 days, but they schedule their first service for after 60 days. If the provider does not call Access and ask for what's called a 14-day extension on the wrapper, they will not be able to enter that admission, right? Because it doesn't allow you to add an admission if it's more than 60 days after the request date. Does this make sense? So the admission is scheduled for after the 60 days. They know they're going to have trouble. I'm not going to be able to enter that into the wrapper because it's more than 60 days away. I'm going to have to get an extension. This will allow them to add that admission to the wrapper. And so since you guys are Access, I need to tell you guys how to do the extension. They won't be doing it. It'll be you. So they give you a call. They say, I've got somebody scheduled to come in. Can you please add this extension? This is what you do. First of all, when you're looking for the wrapper, you're going to have to hit show expired wrappers because at this point it's going to be expired and the expired ones don't show up automatically. You have to ask for it. Then you hit override expiration date. Then you are allowed to get to this box that says allow this request to be valid for an additional 14 days beyond the standard 60. You have to give a reason justifying this. And in this, you're going to want to say they called within the 60 days, give the date, and they needed their expiration date extended because their intake is scheduled for whatever, past the 60 days. This is the only excuse for this to work. And I really think, I don't know, maybe you guys could tell me differently, but I think this is going to be rare. One last itty bitty thing. Let's say they did all that stuff. So they called on 2/28 before the 60 days is over. And they said, I'd like my first service to be on 3/11. The provider called Access and said, can you please put a 14-day extension? So now the wrapper is good until like 3/15. And then let's say they no-show that service on 3/11. And then they call again. And you have to put in another wrapper. If that happens, you need to undo this checkbox because otherwise you're going to get some overlap logic giving you trouble. I'll talk about that in a second. Is that clear? Is that unclear? So bottom line is, this is how you toggle between extension or not extension. You click the box or you uncheck the box. So that was the thing to make sure that nobody is adding services to expired wrappers. The next thing is making sure that people don't enter multiple wrappers. You shouldn't be entering a wrapper if there's already an active one out there. So here's that example again. Suppose we had an initial call on January 1st, first service was canceled. Then they call again February 1st requesting a service. This second one is a continuation of the call on 1/1. It's not a new reportable request, and as a result, you're not going to be allowed to enter a wrapper. If you accidentally try to do that, you're going to be stopped with an error. Here's what it looks like. So let's say this was the first wrapper you entered. The request date was 1/1. Let's say it's it's Livingston, and they were going to be sent to Catholic Charities. And let's say they no-show their first appointment at Catholic Charities, and Access gets another call from them like, hey, I'm new. Can I please get seen at Catholic Charities? Or whatever. If you try to put in a new wrapper that says 2/1 is the request date, go into Catholic Charities, you'll get this error. There's already an active wrapper out there for Catholic Charities. This is a continuation of that. So this is what you don't do. What you do, you can go back into the first wrapper and enter a note if you want. The consumer no-showed the appointment on 1/3, so they called to reschedule on 2/1. You could enter a request for service in Cricut. You could enter a call log in Cricut, or whatever your local procedure is. The only thing you cannot do is enter another wrapper when there's already one out there. Any questions about that? Okay.
Hey, Jessica, it's Anna.
Hey.
Hey, so I just want to clarify, we don't want to enter multiple wrappers, but there may be different services authorized by different wrappers
Yep.
that could potentially be open at the same time?
Yes, I'll talk about
So
that
it's not-
next.
Okay, so it's not necessarily that there won't be multiple wrappers, just not multiple wrappers for the same service at the same place.
Exactly. If it's clear, it's just like perfect segue. If it's clear that the person's going to different providers for different services, that's perfectly legitimate and you can enter multiple wrappers. So first, let me talk about what it looks like at CMH Access, and then Anna, I'll talk about what it looks like at ROSC Access. So at CMH Access, I think it's going to be really super clear. Here's an example. Let's say the person calls CMH Access on 1-1. From this single call, Access determines they're going to go to Catholic Charities for outpatient, and at the same time, they're going to go to Key for Vivitrol. At the same time, from the same request. So in this case, there are two separate requests here. They're asking for two separate services, two separate providers. So you would enter wrapper 1, assessed by Catholic Charities. Wrapper 2, same request date. This one assessed by his Key Development. Because these two don't match, there's going to be no problem. No error will be triggered. This is perfectly legitimate. Let's talk about ROSC now. Let's say consumer calls Home and New Vision on the 1st. Home and New Vision does a face-to-face and determines that they're going to go to Sacred Heart for detox, but they're going to also receive in-house services at Home and New Vision at the very same time. Bottom line, two different SUD treatment agencies. So in this case, there will be two wrappers, and each of them will have a different SUD treatment agency. And that's why I was saying earlier, it's really in your best interest to fill this in just as soon as you know it. Because even though the assessed by providers match in these two wrappers, if the SUD treatment agencies don't match, you're not going to trigger an error. It'll be fine. Anna, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Are there any questions about this, about when it's okay to do multiples and how to not get an error? Okay. Then the last thing I want to talk about is it's not new. This has been a thorn in everybody's side evidently for a while, but we just fixed it now. So from what I understand, although this seems like it should be able to be fine, it was giving errors and you guys weren't able to do it because of a BH-TUDS problem, not because of the two requests thing. So we've taken care of that. The way we're doing it, and let me just quickly say, CMH Access, this does not apply to you. This is only for ROSC Access now because they do referral forms. It does not apply to people who don't use referral forms. Okay, so ROSC Access, what if you're referring out to more than one SUD treatment or you're referring out to one and you're keeping one? What we're doing now is we're saying that a BH-TUDS does not need to be done on every referral form. This is how we're getting around that error that you were getting. It should be done almost all the time, but let me just specifically say, here are the cases where you wouldn't want to do it. There's two cases. Number one, where ROSC Access is referring out and serving in-house simultaneously. So the name of the game is you can't have more than one BH-TUDS from a given provider on a given day. That's the thing that'll make problems. So this is that same example. Consumer calls Home and Vision on the 1st. They do their assessment, I don't know, on the 10th, whatever. Determine the consumer is going to go to Sacred Heart for detox, but they're also going to receive in-house services at Home and New Vision. As shown before, we're going to have two wrappers. One of them where we have the SUD treatment agency as Home and New Vision, and the other one where the SUD treatment agency is Sacred Heart. So to the first one, Home and New Vision is going to enter their SUD admission. There's no choice on this one. SUD admission will always require a BH-TUDS. So that'll be done there. But on their referral form to Sacred Heart, they will not want to do a BH-TUDS because they've already done one for that day. So there's a way to get through the referral form without creating a BH-TUDS and it won't create an error therefore. Does this make sense, guys? Ross, guys?
Kim, that's the answer to the question that you had. Does that make sense? There's something going on with her microphone, so we might just wait for her to type yes in the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna I'll hold for questions at the end too. Like we'll have time. We're almost at the end, so here's the second of two cases. Exactly two examples where you wouldn't want to do BH-TEDS on a referral form. Suppose the consumer calls Dawn Miller on 1-1. Dawn does a face-to-face, and they determine that the consumer is going to receive women's specialty services at Home and New Vision and short-term residential at Hagira. So we have like 3 separate providers now. Dawn is assessing, and they're referring out to Home and New Vision and Hagira. So now we have 2 wrappers. Each one has a referral form, but the rule again is Dawn can only do 1 BH-TEDS on a given day. So they're either going to add their BH-TEDS to the first wrapper's referral form, or to the second wrapper's referral form, but not both. Any questions about that? I wish I could see this chat that you're talking about, Joe. I don't know where it is.
I will add that if a core provider, a ROS provider, forgets to do a BH-TEDS on one of these 2 and they go to enter their H0001 encounter, it won't accept it because there's no TEDS record.
Good point. Yep, that's another change that happened, not as part of this project, but as part of other things going on with finance. SUD providers are not allowed to enter services if they're not enclosed within a BH-TEDS episode. So yeah, don't forget it. You'll be stopped on the claim or data sheet end if you do. So the last thing is to make sure that we all get it. There's a quiz. I'm going to pause the recording and we can all take 5. And that'll give everybody time to fill this out, and then we'll reconvene and talk about what the answers are. So I am going to stop recording right now, or pause it. Guys, okay. So each of these situations is based on Jesse client calling on 1-1, and we want to know wrapper 1, wrapper 2, do we need it? And if so, what are the details? So suppose Access takes his call on 1-1. At the screening, Access determines that he's best served by an outside agency, and they don't authorize services at any in-network SUD provider. Who enters the wrapper?
No one.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody. So remember, it's only approved if they're expected somewhere for their first service. So there is no wrapper in this situation. Any questions about that one? Okay. All right, so the next one, Jesse leaves a message with his name and number on 1-1 because Access was on a different line at the time. They call him back on 1-2, they get an answering machine. Jesse calls back on 120, and this time Access takes his call. They authorize him to provider A on 120. Who enters the wrapper? Provider A? No, Access. That was the whole deal. Provider A is not a ROS provider, I'm assuming. They can't do their own. What is the request date? Even though Jesse didn't speak with anyone until 120, he called on 1-1 and left his name and number.
It would be 1-1, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Did they need an extension on that first wrapper? No, there's no reason for that. Is there a second wrapper for the 120?
No.
No, because it's still within the 60 days. If you tried to enter a wrapper, you would get an error. Okay, this next one is really super straightforward. I'm just going to say who enters access. So Jesse, they take his call on 1/1, and he's scheduled for an assessment on 1/30. What is the request date? 1/1 or 1/30? Anybody?
1/1.
Yep, 1/1. No extension is needed. This is very straightforward. All right, so this is a continuation of that. He was scheduled on 1/30. He no-shows on 1/30, and then he calls again on 2/1. So we're still in that same wrapper, access. The request date on that first wrapper is still 1/1. There's no extension needed. Is there another wrapper going to be entered? No, because it's still a continuation. We haven't passed that 60-day mark. If he calls again, you might want to put a note on that wrapper, that first wrapper, but no, you can't enter a new one. Okay, so let's say he calls on 1/30. He no-shows on, he calls on 1/1. He no-shows on 1/30. He calls on 2/1. He's scheduled on 2/15 and no-shows that. And then he calls on 3/15. So now this is the situation we have. Access entering the first wrapper with a request date of 1/1. Is there an extension needed? Anyone? No, an extension is not needed. Is there a second wrapper?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm going to put a note here. Does this make sense? Access enters the wrapper, and who's going to call them? Jesse, not provider A. Does this make sense, guys? Okay. What is the request date for the second wrapper? 3/15. Is there an extension needed? No, there's no reason for that. Oops, you know what? That doesn't make sense. But it's actually asking who calls. The answer is just Jesse. Okay, so more and more complicated. He calls on 1/1. He no-shows on 1/30. He calls again on 2/1, and he no-shows that. And then he calls on 2/28 to reschedule, and his assessment is scheduled at provider A on 3/2. So the first wrapper, access enters it. The request date was 1/1. Is a 14-day extension needed? Yes, this is the one. Where no call came in after 60 days, but you still, you need a way to enter an admission or referral form to that same wrapper. There's no second wrapper in this situation. Are there any questions about that one? Okay. And then this last one. So he was supposed to come in on 3/2, and he no-showed that as well. And then he calls again on 3/5. So now there has been a call outside of the 60-day mark. So you would have two wrappers in this case. So the first one, access enters the first wrapper. The request date is 1/1. Do you want an extension? The answer is no, you really don't. I can understand why you would think it wouldn't hurt anything. But if they end up coming back again and you have to enter that second wrapper, if you try to do it without getting rid of that extension, you're going to get that overlap error, because it's going to think you're still, it's going to think, oh, there's still an active wrapper out there. You can't add one. So you want to undo it, make the new wrapper. Who calls access to do this? Jesse calls. What's the request date on the second one? 3/5. Is an extension needed? No. I just really quickly want to say, who calls to get the 14-day extension in that second to last problem? Jesse? Or provider A? Yeah. So providers call to get extensions, consumers call to get new wrappers put in.
Which means they need to be screened again.
Yes, new wrapper means new screening. This is not our rule. The state has said that if 60 days has gone by, then it's time to look at that case again. This last page is strictly a ROSC situation. So CMH access, you don't necessarily need this unless someone is telling you you do. Did you guys have a chance to look at this one in your 5 minutes? Well, with that silence, I have to just assume you did. So let's go over it. Stop me if someone needs time. So let's say Jesse client calls Dawn Miller on 1-1. At the assessment at Dawn, it's determined that Jesse's going to go, they're going to stay in Dawn for outpatient. At the same time, they're going to go to Hagira for short-term residential. There will be 2 wrappers because there's 2 treatments, 2 separate treatments. So in wrapper number 1, the assessed by provider is Dawn, and in wrapper number 2, the assessed by provider is Dawn, right? Because that's who's assessing them each time. The SUD treatment agency on the first one is again Dawn Miller. And the agency on the second one is Hagira. Would there be a referral form in this wrapper? No, they're keeping them. Would there be a referral form in the second wrapper? Yes, they're sending them. Would there be a BH TEDS on this referral form, NA, for the first wrapper? But on the second one, would you put a BH TEDS on this? This is really the crux of the biscuit, guys. What do you think? BH TEDS on this? Yes or no? The answer is no. You'd get an error because there's already a BH TEDS on this admission. Which brings me to this. Is there a SUD admission from Dawn? Yes. Is there a SUD admission from Dawn? No. Any questions about that? Okay. So this is still a continuation of Jesse calling Dawn on January 1st. At the assessment, Dawn determines that Jesse's going to go to Home and New Vision for outpatient and Hagira for short term. So again, we have 2 wrappers because there's 2 separate requests going, 2 separate treatments being sought. So the assessed by provider again is Dawn in both of these. It doesn't matter which is which, but let's just say that wrapper number 1 is Home and New Vision. It's a SUD treatment agency, and it's Hagira in the second wrapper. Does Dawn do a referral form in these? Yes and yes. Then the next one, it doesn't matter what you pick. One of these should say yes on the referral form and the other should say no. It doesn't matter if the yes is on Home and New Vision or if the yes is on Hagira, but you just can't have both. So I'm just going to say yes and no. It could have easily been no and yes. And then last, is there a SUD admission from Dawn? No. And that is the end of the training, guys. At this time, if anybody has any final questions, can you please speak up?
Hi, this is Rebecca with Livingston County.
Hey, Rebecca.
Hi. If we're authorizing someone to go to Dawn Farm for, say, detox and residential, would we enter 2 wrappers because the 2 locations have different providers in our authorization, or does Dawn Farm do a transfer and we just make 1 wrapper for the detox?
It's a great question. You would do 1 wrapper for the detox and then Dawn could transfer them. If they're going to
Okay.
one provider for treatment, it's one wrapper, even if it's
Just
separate.
one. Okay.
Oh, great question.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions?
It's Anna again.
Hi.
Maybe we're just doing it wrong, but I think that my recollection is that we were told we had to do separate wrappers for all of those things. So like when we transfer internally, even from detox to residential, we have to do separate wrappers for those, or we have been.
Yeah, so what Rebecca was saying is she would send them to you, and then you would do, and this is a new thing, transfer them. Where is that? Since you guys are a ROSC provider, it doesn't really matter, but Hagira would do it the same way. Is if you're going from detox to the next, then you can transfer them and make your own wrapper that way.
Okay, so we would still need to enter a wrapper for the second service, but we would just do it. The referring party wouldn't need to.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't want to open a humongous can of worms here because I don't know if our administrators have made this choice yet, but if you are doing more than one service and the first one isn't detox,
Mm-hmm.
you could actually admit that. I mean, according to BHTED's rules, you could admit them to one level of care and discharge them from the other, and you don't actually have to do a separate transfer. The only reason we discharge and readmit after detox is so for indicator 4B, we can get the discharge.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. So the plan is to make this live. I want to say like maybe, is it next week? Sometime really, really soon. We'll give warning. You'll see all these changes. Then you guys will sort of marinate in it for a few weeks. It's hard to know what your questions are unless you've used it a little bit. So the idea is we're going to let you use it a little bit. The data start going to the state 4/1. So we wanted to give everybody a chance to, make their mistakes before it counts. Then we're going to reconvene and have an in-person training of all this same stuff. And then I have a feeling that you guys will have much more, there'll be more questions, and you'll find bugs that we didn't find, and we'll get it all taken care of, hopefully. So if you have any questions, please email your SUD liaison, and they will funnel it up to the right person. Best of luck with this, and thanks you guys for your time.
Hey, Jessica, can I ask you one other question?
You bet.
It's probably super farm specific, so if everyone else wants to hang up, that's also fine, but anyone who wants to listen
go ahead.
as well. Okay, so how the process works on our side is someone would come into detox, for example, and while they're in detox, they'll do like their full level of care assessment and might transition to residential, or maybe residential plus an outpatient service, which might be like psych or case management, or they might start doing an outpatient group. So it's like there might be a lot of services happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So right now how it works is like we'll have a wrapper for detox, so it seems pretty clear, and then a wrapper for the residential portion, and then a wrapper for the outpatient portion.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like, is the transfer really for like going from detox to residential?
It's
and
from
then we
going
open
the
a new wrapper for the outpatient stuff? Do you know what I mean?
So yeah, I do. I think so you're saying what if it's like from this to many things? And let me just answer your question that you asked. You hit the nail on the head. Is it for detox to residential? It's for detox to anything. It's really just so we can get the discharge date on the detox. According to the state's rules, you can admit them, like on the admission form, BHTEDS, you could be putting that they are going in as res, and you could keep them and without even doing this transfer DLA. According to the state's rules, you could just move them on to outpatient or do it at the same time or whatever. And then on the discharge within that same wrapper, have it going out to outpatient or whatever it is.
Right.
Matter. You can be within a single admission doing lots of levels of care. The only time you really want to pop it out is if you're going to be leaving detox to the next service, because we have no other way to know that date than to do the transfer. So in your example, let me just like put the rubber on the road. They're going from detox to residential and outpatient and a bunch of stuff. If it were me, and you do need to check with like Nicole and Joellen, because I don't know that we have administrative rules in place on this, but if it were my vote, I would say do this transfer thing. You transfer them out. You have a new request date, and just for the admission, just choose whatever service is going to happen first. I mean, one of them, they're not going to be exactly side by side, right? Like one service.
Yeah.
Yeah. Choose that one as your level of care and let them flow through the different levels of care. When it's time to discharge whichever service happened last.
That I think I hear what you're saying. Like different levels of care can happen under the same SUD admission.
Yeah.
That makes my brain fry, kind of.
I know. Okay. Do you
Like
want
to think about, like, because then I feel like I go into someone's file in Cricut, and it just like it isn't clear to me like what services that person's been involved with. If like what was selected on an admission doesn't necessarily mean that that's the treatment service that they received.
Right.
Like it's clear to me if I can see like, oh, they have an outpatient admission and they have a residential admission and they have a detox admission and a discharge.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Like,
so here is
your side if we do them.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. We need to check with Joellen. I can tell you from the state's perspective, they actually prefer it that way. Let me tell you what I think are the actual on the ground options for you. Number one is what I said, just do the all that stuff under one admission, as long as Joellen and Nicole are okay with it. You could put in the notes section, like, yeah, I'm admitting them for this, but here's all the stuff they're getting.
Right.
That's not comfortable for you. I haven't actually tested this, but see if that transfer thing works more than once. Maybe you could make transfer to outpatient, transfer to residential. And if that's really something you need to have, then I have a feeling it will work. And if it doesn't work, then we need to make it work.
Okay, cool. Because I'm even thinking about it for like data when we're pulling like how many clients were served in residential this year and how many clients were served in whatever. Like
good point. I
think that stuff, I mean, you would know better than me, but I think that stuff gets pulled from how many, or maybe it just gets pulled from encounters. I'm not even sure.
I don't, it's probably pulled different places for different reports, but I get your meaning.
Okay, cool. All right, I appreciate you.
Yeah, you too. Any other questions? Okie dokie. I'm going to stop recording then. Thank you guys all for your time. Best of luck with this. We'll be talking to you soon. Bye-bye.